So it's a real pleasure for me to be here today, and particularly because we're going to have two really terrific panelists to talk about this important issue. Ted Alden is a former colleague of mine. We worked together at the Financial Times. He's now at the Council on Foreign Relations. Ted, in my view, is probably the preeminent expert south of the border on Canada-US border issues. We're really lucky to hear from him. He is technically American, but I consider him to be an adopted Canadian. He grew up in Vancouver, and he revealed to me and John as we were having a coffee beforehand that for him the key test of loyalty, right, was it Norman Tebbit who had the cricket test in Britain? So Ted had the hockey test in the Olympics, and I'm sorry, Americans, but he rooted for Team Canada. Of course, the right choice, in my view. We're also going to hear from David Bercuson. David does probably a half dozen jobs, a dozen jobs at the University of Calgary. It's hard to find an area in which he's not an expert. He's also a really prolific writer. I was just talking about pieces of his on the Canadian military and its role that I've been enjoying in the Globe and Mail. David, his particular area of expertise is the Canada-US security partnership, particularly the military, and he's a real expert on the Canadian military. And also, I'm very pleased to say, a fellow Albertan. So what we thought we would do is have me ask Ted and David questions for about 25 minutes, and then leave 20 minutes for questions from the audience. So please get ready with the toughest ones you can think of. And I'm going to start, Ted, by asking you to talk about what is happening on the border. That's been a really fraught issue, I think, even for those of us traveling across it, but also, has real implications for trade. Are there any positive developments coming up?
I actually think so. I actually think that we may be in the early stages of what could be a real sea change in terms of U.S.-Canada cooperation on the border. If we go back to 9/11, which was the subject of a book I wrote a couple of years ago, there was sort of immediately after 9/11, a flourish of efforts to try to build U.S.-Canada partnerships in terms of border management. And then the issue really fell off the table, and things got steadily worse at the border. You heard a lot of that on the previous panel about the difficulties with cross-border trade. Cross-border travel was quite striking. There's a graph that was put together out of the University of Western Washington looking at travel between British Columbia and Washington State before and after 9/11. It used to be completely correlated with the value of the Canadian dollar. When the Canadian dollar would go up, everybody from Vancouver would flood south to shop. When the dollar got weaker, people would stop. That relationship ended after 9/11. Canadians just stopped going south, even as the dollar strengthened. So we went through a long period there where there was really a lot of tension over border issues. Starting late last year and culminating in February with the announcement by Prime Minister Harper and President Obama, I think we're at the start of what could be a real change. And most of that came from the Canadian end. The Canadians really did two things. One, they decided that the trilateral talks that had been going on for some years, what was called the Security and Prosperity Partnership with the US, Mexico, and Canada, really weren't dealing with the core Canadian issues. They basically said, we want to wrap up the SPP. It isn't doing what we need it to do. And secondly, the Harper administration made what I think was really a politically courageous decision at a time they had a minority government to reintroduce the idea of perimeter security. That the only way that the two countries were going to deal with some of the facilitation problems at the border was to more closely coordinate on keeping what's referred to as bad things and bad people out of the North American space. So sharing far more information on passengers coming to Canada and the United States, doing cargo inspections well in advance, cooperating at a deeper level across the board in a way we had really not seen post 9/11. We'd seen kind of two systems develop in parallel. Now what we're seeing is a real intermeshing. I mean, to take just one example, we have now what's called Operation Freerider, which operates in the Great Lakes with the U.S. Coast Guard and the Canadian equivalent. Both countries now can pursue across national boundaries if they're chasing someone who's fleeing away across the water. That's a much deeper level of cooperation. There was always, a kind of handoff. Once someone got to the border, it had to be handed off to the Canadian or U.S. side. So I can give other examples as we talk, but what we're about to see in a few weeks is the first series of concrete announcements of initiatives under this Obama-Harper agreement. The U.S. and Canadian negotiators at quite a senior level, White House in the United States, a former Privy Council head leading the negotiations for Canada. We're about to see the rollout of a series of kind of short, mid, and long-term initiatives that I think really is going to deepen security cooperation at the border far beyond what we have ever seen before.
So you described this, Ted, as being politically courageous for the Prime Minister. That sometimes means that a lot of people hate it.
Yeah.
And it hasn't been universally popular, right? I mean, there was a story in the CBC of a woman who wasn't let into the U.S. because of too much sharing. What's the blowback, and is some of it justified?
I think some of it is justified. I think the parts that are justified have to do with legitimate Canadian concerns about the sharing of terrorism-related information with the United States. And it goes back to the Irar case, where you had erroneous information that went from Canadian to U.S. officials that ended up with this Canadian being tortured in Syrian jails. There, you mentioned, CBC had a story this morning about Canadians who have mental health issues who've been visited by the police. There was a woman who had a suicide attempt, and the police came to her house because there was a call by her roommate. Well, that's now in the Canadian police databases. That information was shared with U.S. border officials. She was trying to go on a trip to Los Angeles, was told she couldn't come into the United States. She sorted it out. So there are genuine sensitive issues that have to do with the sharing of this kind of information. A second concern, which I think has not been as legitimate, is the fear that somehow Canada would have to adopt U.S. immigration provisions holus bolus, so that Canada would have to harmonize its refugee provisions, which are generally more liberal, with the more conservative U.S. provisions, or would have to impose visas on exactly the same countries that the U.S. is doing. They both move beyond that. Both sides have agreed we don't need that kind of harmonization. What we need is information sharing so that we know who's coming into each country, and we can share police and security information, intelligence information we may have about those individuals. So I think that's been a fear for a long time, but I think the two governments have been able to move beyond that.
Okay, thank you very much, Ted. And we'll come back to some of those border issues in a minute, but I'd like to bring David into the conversation. David, maybe we can move a little bit more to your specific area of expertise and talk about the military partnership there. Something we were discussing earlier is, the debates within the Canadian military and thinking about who is the better partner for Canada. Is it NATO, or is it a more direct partnership with the United States? Tell us about that debate.
Well, that's a good place to start. I don't think, there's no doubt in my mind, as a result of our experience in Afghanistan, and this is true both of the Army and also of the Air Force, because of the Air Division, Air Detachment that we've been running in Afghanistan for the last several years, that there is a much greater desire to work more closely with the U.S. military than was the case before. Now, there has been a great desire to do this on the part of all three of our services for a long, long time, and the Navy has been conducting joint exercises with the U.S. Navy, replacing Canadian frigate, replacing U.S. destroyers with Canadian frigates in carrier battle groups. That goes back to the 1990s. They work very, very closely together. But I think Canada has seen in Afghanistan NATO's political weaknesses translated into operational weaknesses. The recent memoir published by the former Chief of Defense Staff, Rick Hillier, General Hillier, rails against NATO, and NATO is not prepared to do these kinds of things, fight wars like this. And when you get right down to kind of the grunt level, an article I'm working on right now, what lessons Canada needs to learn from Afghanistan, and I was privileged to interview the former battle group commander who went into Kandahar in March of 2006. And they were the ones who ran up against the Taliban in big numbers in May of 2006. They were saying that, that they expected certain assets from NATO that just never showed up. And it wasn't just the well-known issue of caveats. It had to do with equipment, the training. It had to do with doctrine. It had to do with availability. If you're sending Canadian soldiers out there to fight, and they're not sure that a medical evacuation helicopter is going to be available if they get wounded, that's a really serious situation. And we had to make special arrangements with the Americans after 2007 to make sure that we did have U.S. medevac support, because we could never make sure that the Dutch or the British or others were going to come to our aid with their helicopters. So I mean that's kind of a from the ground view of that I'm getting a feeling in certainly in the Army that almost as if NATO they may be looking at NATO today the way they looked at the United Nations in the 1990s, an increasing disparagement of NATO's military capabilities. And the other side of that is the Americans have it. Whatever it is that you need, the Americans have got it, and they're willing to use it to help you out. And whether it's direct assets like fast air, medical evacuation helicopters, or intelligence, or logistics, or supply, or whatever, the Americans are considered the big game, and we need to be able to work with them. And one final thing I'll say is that you really do not achieve high command of the Canadian military today unless you've had operational experience alongside the United States or under senior American commanders. The current Chief of the Defense Staff, General Nitinchik, for example, was a deputy corps commander in Iraq in 2003. And when you look at the Army commander today, he was a deputy corps commander. When you keep going down the list, you're seeing that all of these people have to work with very closely with the Americans to qualify for high command in the Canadian forces today.
So David, there's as you were talking, I was thinking of this Russian saying, which is that love is best when it is requited. You're talking about this Canadian desire to work more closely with the Americans. Do they feel the same way? I mean, isn't Canada just a real midget compared to the U.S. military?
Well, it's a midget in terms of numbers. I think that, we talk a lot, I think we blow our horn too much in Canada about our military capabilities as small but good. I think they're definitely small, and I do think they're very good. But work that I've done recently shows me that when we were first proposing to send our battle group into Kandahar in 2005, when this was under discussion, the American commander in Kandahar was not happy about Canadians coming. He needed to be reassured that Canadians could actually fight.
Well, like on the grounds, like they're not good soldiers?
Yeah, and I think part of that reason is also, and General Hillier goes into it in his memoir, because we had so many caveats ourselves in places like the Balkans during the 1990s, and in Kosovo when we were in there, and in fact even in Kabul when we joined ISAF in 2003. But I think that's very different now with regard to the Army. I think it's been true for a long time with regard to the Navy. I think that there's a lot of respect for the Canadian Navy's capabilities, recognizing that they're rather limited. And with the Air Force, I think it poses a problem for Canada, because the problem it poses for us down the road is if we're not really going to be as tightly connected with NATO militarily in the future, that is operationally, so we're never going to leave NATO or anything like that, then what is our military relationship going to be with the United States? I mean, are we going to become like Australia, where it doesn't matter what America does, we are going to be there too? That's basically been Australian defense policy since World War II, and one can easily understand that. That's not been Canadian defense policy, and I think it's an issue we have to come to grips with.
And what do you think the public policy implications, or maybe the public political implications of that would be? I mean, how would Canadians feel about that sort of candid notion that, okay, our military policy is going to be, we just do whatever the Americans do?
They wouldn't like it. Canadians would definitely not like it. And I don't think I would like it either, but I don't know where the saw-off is. The reality is that we've never gone to war alone, except against, well, I guess when we went to war against you guys in 1812, it was actually...
Do you want to remind people who won there?
The Brits, but we've never gone to war alone. We're always part of a coalition because we're small. That's a reality, and the reality today is that the Americans have got to be there in one way or another, and that's the reality for much of NATO too, because logistically you can't play without the Americans playing alongside you. But the question is, do you do it overtly? And in that, for example, the Australians did that, and I think a very, very good example where the Australians did that, and the people of Australia were very definitely opposed to it. There were two examples. One was definitely in Vietnam, and the other was also in Iraq. But the government of Australia knows, and has known this since the fall of Singapore in 1942, that the United States guarantees Australia's security. And even if it's in a token way, wherever the Americans are, the Australians will be. We don't live in a difficult neighborhood the way the Australians do, so there's no necessity for us to be saying that. But the reality is, I think, that in the future you're going to see a lot close, even a closer military relationship than we've seen in the past.
Ted, I'd love to hear your thoughts on that, and then also specifically, something we've just been hearing from David about, this relationship which is unequal, and the intense Canadian focus on the border and on that U.S. relationship certainly isn't shared in terms of passion in the U.S. How do you make it work?
It's a good question. Just quickly, I have to tell my War of 1812 story because
Of course.
I live in Maryland, and the new Maryland license plates that you get automatically when you buy a new car are celebrating the 200th anniversary of the War of 1812.
Good.
And well, except that the license plate is designed so there's an American flag and what looks under it like a Canadian flag, so like the American flag dominating over the Canadian flag. When we got this license plate, my wife said, we got to pay $50 to get the Chesapeake Bay license plate or I'm not taking this car back to Canada. So we swapped out before we went up to Toronto in the summer.
A wise precaution.
It is interesting on the border because you're absolutely right. I mean, Canada is always the demandeur in these things. There's always, the same is often true in trade relations, but I would say you see it even on steroids in the border relationship. This is a top-level prime ministerial issue in Canada, and it's a mid-level DHS, occasionally State Department, low-level functionary in the White House issue in the United States. And so, interestingly, a lot of border policy ends up driven by what the Canadians want to do. If you look at the relationship under the Bush administration...
Just because they care more?
Because they care more. If you look at the relationship under the Bush administration, they just couldn't break through. The governments were too different. There wasn't a lot of interest in the U.S. side in really dealing with the Canadian concerns. Now with a Democratic American administration and a conservative Canadian government, which is politically actually not all that far from a Democratic American administration.
You mean Canadian conservatives are American Democrats?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot more overlap than you saw previously. There is a willingness to work together. It's not a high-level issue in DHS. The folks who run DHS are essentially concerned about the southern border. I mean, Napolitano's a former Arizona governor. Alden, who's the head of Customs and Border Protections from California, all of his working experiences on the U.S.-Mexico border. Politically, the U.S.-Mexico border is everything for them. The Canadian border is really an afterthought, and Napolitano, several times put her foot in her mouth when she first started dealing with Canadian border issues. But they've gotten smarter about it. They've kind of handed it off to good functionaries at a higher level in the Canadian government and a mid-level in the U.S. government. And I think there's a potential there for making a lot of progress. There was a comment made on the previous panel that I disagree with a little bit, that somehow when this moves into election season, it will be difficult to make progress on border issues. I don't think that's true. I mean, the U.S.-Canada border is just not an electoral issue in the United States. It is in Canada, but it's not in the United States. So, I think at that level, there is the prospect for real and continued progress. I mean, if you got an administration change in the U.S., maybe some fissures would open up again. But I think these two governments work quite well together, and it has more to do with the changes on the Canadian side. So,
I'd like to ask you one more question,
Sure.
A variant of which I'll ask David as well, to maybe sort of connect our conversation with the one earlier this morning, and then we'll throw it open for questions, so get ready. How does, I think the overwhelming issue in Canada, certainly in the United States, and to some extent in Canada, despite Canadian smugness on this matter, is the weak economy. Yeah. So how does that color the security discussion?
I would like to think, and again, there was some optimism voiced on the previous panel, that we are going to see a bit of a change on that front. I think that the characterization of that panel was right. I think for the United States, post 9/11, security has trumped everything. So that they paid lip service to trade facilitation, lip service to making the U.S. immigration border entry procedures friendlier, but anybody who's experienced it knows it's mostly lip service. It's still a pain in the butt to get into the United States. And there was a mentality that developed after 9/11 that I call the sort of myth of the perfectly secure border, that you are going to create a border that's somehow going to keep every bad thing out of the United States. And so every time there's a breach, it becomes an excuse to layer on 2 or 3 more additional layers of security. And in the Canadian part of the border just gets thicker and thicker and thicker and thicker. And I think that has been the dynamic for much of the last decade. But I do think, with the US economy so weak now, the jobs issue really having moved to the forefront, I think the balance is starting to tip a little bit. And I think, we're now, as of 2 days from now, 9/11's 10 years behind us. There hasn't, been another successful terrorist attack inside the United States or in Canada, though there've been some pretty close calls. And so I think there really is the potential for security and economics to come back into much better balance than we've seen over the past decade.
And David, how about your piece of this? And in particular, weak economies, imbalanced budgets, there's a lot of pressure on military budgets.
There's a lot of pressure on military budgets, and we're looking at possibly a 5 to 7% cut in the Canadian defense budget going forward, although, interestingly enough, it may not adversely impact our operational capabilities.
There's
because
just so much waste.
we've been underspending. Basically, the Department of National Defense gave back about $1 billion last year, money that it did not spend because of inefficiencies within the department, largely. But the U.S., the cuts that are coming in the U.S. defense budget, one way or another, are very worrying. Now, most Canadians don't think about defense most of the time, but I think those of us who do worry about the implications to global commerce, about significant cutbacks in the U.S. defense budget. I mean,
So you want the Americans to continue to be the policemen of the world?
We don't want them to be. They have to be. They have to be because they are the Royal Navy of the 21st century. They keep the seas free and they guarantee freedom of navigation as much as possible for the rest of us. Our role is largely a supplementary one. And we talk about the Navy. We talk about our Navy's capability of putting ships to sea and working in conjunction with the U.S. Navy, sometimes actually commanding American ships. But interestingly enough, about a month and a half ago, 2 months ago, Prime Minister Harper said something that not very many people in Canada picked up on, and that is that with the U.S. Probably ramping down its defense expenditures, many of the rest of us, i.e. allies of the United States, are going to have to think twice about how deeply we cut our own defense budgets. So I think that there is beginning to be an understanding there that we may have to do more, either relatively or directly, as the U.S. does less. But the fewer cuts there are here, the less deep they are, the safer I think a lot of us will feel.
And do you think Canadian taxpayers are prepared to do that?
I don't
step up as the U.S.
I don't think
steps
Canadian taxpayer,
back?
quite honestly, and I am a Canadian taxpayer, but I'm paid to think about these things. I don't think Canadian taxpayers think too often about how important it is that the oil get through the South China Sea to Japan and South Korea unimpeded by the Chinese, or what the implications are of the growth of Chinese blue water capability in the future. I think most Canadians don't think so. But I think what they need to think is, if we can put one more ship out there that will replace an American ship in an American carrier battle group, for example, that's one less bit of burden that the United States has got to bear. And it may be a tiny one compared to their global one, but it's an important contribution for us to make symbolically and politically. And I think when you put it, I hope that when you put that to Canadians, they'll understand that, because, as we saw from the previous panel, I think it's 40 cents of every dollar in my pocket depends on our trade with the United States, and that's a fact almost every Canadian knows.
Okay, I think we can throw it open to questions at that point. Anybody want to go first? Please, ma'am. And I think we have microphones.
On the radio this morning, I heard that you did find some dynamite in Ottawa. Could you elaborate on that? I believe they said 2,000 pounds of explosives were found in Ottawa and stopped on the radio this morning.
Okay, I didn't. I'll take a crack at that. And
yeah, I didn't. I was working on something else this morning. I didn't
that particular episode, but I do know this. There have
we
been.
say thank you.
Sorry?
And we say thank you.
Well,
the question, did people hear the question? I think the question was that there was a report that 2,000 tons of dynamite.
On the radio this morning,
dynamite, yeah.
Ottawa stopped 2,000 or 3,000 pounds of dynamite. or explosives, I think were the words. And
At the Canada-US border.
I just heard from Ottawa, in Ottawa. And they were talking about that, and that it was stopped before it came in, and
Hadn't heard.
they're interrogating the people who had it. I just,
Do you have comments, gentlemen? or do you
only a
want to take pass?
housewife listening to a radio.
I think I'll take a pass because I unfortunately didn't hear it, so I can't really add anything.
I didn't hear the
Apologize.
report
Yeah,
either.
yeah.
No.
Okay, well, thank you for that superior information
And we'll
to
follow
those of
up.
us here, and we'll follow up. There you go. Another question? Please, sir. And could we have the mic up here? Yeah.
I have a question having to do with the interface between international security and economics, having to do more precisely with the cooperation or the direction of cooperation between Canada and the United States with respect to the Arctic and the Russians' contention of planting a flag and having the ability to engage in mining activities and the like. Where do you see the direction of those issues with respect to cooperation between the two countries?
Yeah. Arctic, great question. David?
The Arctic issue is one that should be easily solvable. The more contentious of the issues is really not about navigation through the Northwest Passage. It's about the Beaufort Sea and mineral rights in the Beaufort Sea. And if it's treated with common sense by both governments, I don't see why there would be an issue there, because it's certainly not in the interests of either government to try to create an issue of uncertainty in an area where drilling is difficult to begin with for obvious reasons. I think it was dragged out simply because there's been a lot of chest thumping on both sides of the border and no serious effort to get down to it. The issue of navigation through the Northwest Passage, I think, is one that should just be as easily resolvable, but in other means. I mean, to me, it's a simple matter of each side taking note of the other's position, and the United States realizing and recognizing that the Coast Guard facilities, naval facilities, when we actually do get the Arctic patrol vessels, the air facilities, much of the satellite communications, and surveillance is Canadian, and we're going to be doing 90 to 100% of the surveying and the policing of the Arctic Waters Navigation Act, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, we're going to do it because it's our waters, whether it's our waters in a de jure sense or de facto sense, we're going to do it. So if people would simply sort of get off these positions and say, okay, we claim freedom of navigation through all international waterways, which, by the way, is absolutely in the Canadian interest, absolutely in the Canadian interest. We say, right, but let us get on with the job of putting our posts up there and doing the surveillance and organizing the rescue facilities and so on. There was a minor plane crash. I say minor, there were a number of people who were killed a couple of weeks ago. It happened to be right near a number of Canadian forces engaged in their annual exercise up there, and so there was a very, very quick response. But with a number of aircraft that are flying over the Arctic today and huge passenger jets and so on, it'd be a nightmare to think about trying to do that without having assets in place beforehand. So I think in the next year or two, we're going to see a lot more progress toward the resolution of these issues. I'm very optimistic about it.
Okay, so David, you make it seem easy. What is the opposition to this very common sense policy?
I think on the Canadian side, the problem has been largely a minority government since 2004. And I mean, that's been a problem in a number of ways. It doesn't need to be a problem. I think that you can be forthright even though you have a minority government position, and both the Liberal governments of Paul Martin and Harper government in minority positions have been forthright in certain ways. But it's a lot more difficult to go out there and do your thing when you've got minority government. I mean, we were talking about somebody was mentioning the endless American election cycle. Well, we've been in an endless election cycle from 2004 until this May. And it's not easy to get long-term policy done on that basis. So I think from the Canadian side, that's been the problem.
Ted, anything to add?
No, I'm delighted with that answer.
Okay.
Far more knowledgeable on that subject than I am, so I appreciate it.
Okay. Any more questions? Come on. I'll have to ask more. Please.
You mentioned the realization. You mentioned the realization of wanting to work more and coordinate more with the U.S. military. But as you also discussed, there's some serious fiscal consolidation issues, especially around defense spending in this country. So along those lines, you know, a lot of people in the United States feel that the rest of the world has enjoyed a kind of a discounted or a unpaid for benefit of what you talked about in terms of the massive U.S. Defense Department and its role internationally. Has there been any thought about how the Canadian military can move in the direction of working more closely, preserve the political realities of not wanting to be a automatic ally in all of the U.S. excursions, which I think will be limited going forward based on the budget issues, but also the real financial issues associated with being a more active and participating partner in terms of the cost involved in terms of our global responsibilities? Well,
I think we don't have to say very much about it because I think we've largely done it. There used to be an annual report that was put out by Congress on Allied contributions to the common defense. It was available on the internet. I used to read it every single year. And in the late 90s and the early part of this century, invariably we got on as the Freerider. And the American ambassadors in Ottawa would constantly badger Canadian governments on their cuts in the defense spending and the hollowing out of the Canadian military in the 1990s, and rightly so. But the contribution, I mean, we began to restore our defense budget in 2005. It was actually prior to the current conservative budget, and the defense budget has gone up from about $13 billion in 2004 to about $21 billion today. That's a significant increase. And you can see it in the size of the military, you can see it in the new kit and equipment and so on, but you can also see it in Afghanistan and in Kandahar. Because in 2006 and 2008, we were running from one side of Kandahar province to the other, trying to keep it out of the hands of the Taliban, and took, I think the total number was 158 Canadian dead, which for the 28,000 troops that rotated through Afghanistan, it was quite a lot. And the Canada as Freerider disappeared completely in Washington. And I just hope that the fact that we've pulled out of Kandahar, are now doing a training mission in Kabul, doesn't impact that. I don't know a single congressman personally, but I have a feeling that all politicians are the same as what have you done for me lately? And 6 months from now, they'll say, oh, you were in Kandahar once, were you? I worry about that. But right now, I think things are good, and most Americans who are engaged in these issues know that we are not a free rider and don't intend to become one in the near future. I think just the opposite.
I would just add, I think you're seeing the same kind of shift when it comes to the Homeland Security aspects of the misnamed war on terrorism. I think if you go back even a couple of years, the view in the U.S. government was that Canada was largely uninterested. So for instance, senior DHS people used to have a chart that showed information that the Canadian government was sharing actively with the United States on, people on terrorist watch lists, other suspicious passengers coming into the North American space, cargo inspection, and there were big X's for lack of Canadian cooperation in all these areas. I mean, U.S.-Mexico cooperation was actually far better when it came to scrutinizing people coming into North America. The Mexicans, on a real-time basis, make available to the Department of Homeland Security the passenger lists for everyone flying into Mexico. So the U.S. is able to see,
flying
into Mexico. So if you're on a flight from London into Mexico City, your information is being scrutinized by the U.S. Department of Homeland Security, and if you appear on a U.S. terrorist watch list, a phone call is going to go to the Mexican officials that this is a guy, when he arrives in Mexico City, you better pull him aside. That kind of cooperation has never taken place with Canada. What we're seeing as part of this new initiative is many more of that kind of deep information sharing. And Canada has even begun to adopt some of the border screening measures that the U.S. put in place. One example is the U.S. visit fingerprint system. So Canadians don't face this coming over the land border, but anybody coming in by air now who's not an American is routinely fingerprinted when they come in, and that helps the U.S. with accurate identification and with checks against people who might be of concern. Canada is now moving to putting a similar system in place after many years of saying, no, there's no value to this. Another example, if you are coming into the United States now from Europe or from other countries where you don't need a visa, you need to apply in advance. You need to go online and give basic information about yourself to the US authorities, and then you'll be quickly approved for what they call the ESTA, the Electronic System of Travel Authorization, so you can fly to the United States. A small handful of cases, it will come back as a non-approval, then you'll have to go into the US Embassy or the consulate and apply for a visa. Canada has no similar system in place for travelers from non-visa countries, moving to put that sort of system in place. So I think in the terrorism aspects of security as well, Canada is going to be seen as much less of a problem from the US perspective than has been the case in the past.
Okay, so I want to play devil's advocate with these benign scenarios you've both been painting. So starting with David, I can understand why from the American perspective, Canada ceasing to be a free rider in defense is a great thing. But if I were a Liberal or an NDP politician, I could imagine making a pretty powerful case that it's fantastic to be a free rider. Canada has its own fiscal problems, and you know, if the Americans are prepared to be the policemen of the world, let them.
Yeah, good point. And I think for much of the Canada-U.S. defense relationship since 1945, that's been a prevailing attitude in Ottawa. The challenge for Canadians is always, well, we know we can't do nothing, because if we do nothing, you're going to do it for us. So like Winston Churchill says, everybody's got a military, their own or somebody else's, right? So we don't want that. But we also, we can't do everything. Well, you know, it's it's second largest country in landmass in the world, 3 coastlines, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, you know, impossible, literally. So where's the balance? How much do you do? And for a long time, the answer was you do as little as you can get away with, no question about it. And I'm not going to say this was from a partisan perspective, liberal or conservative. I think that began to change quite dramatically. It wasn't always the same, by the way. In the early years of the Cold War, Canada did a lot. But I think that changed about 2004. And it changed with the change, if I may say, the change in leadership of the Liberal Party from Jean Chrétien to Paul Martin, and the coming to the Ministry of National Defence of Bill Graham, the beginning of the restoration of the Canadian defence budget, and the understanding that we had taken it too far, we had allowed it to go too far. And I don't see that changing in the future. I think that it's now too well established that you've got to have, for Canada, robust military capability in North American defense cooperation, because it buys you or helps to buy you entry into this congressperson's office or that congressperson's office. Won't get you much once you're in, and then you talk about trade. But at least nobody's going to say, we know about you guys, you're the ones that don't do anything to help us out.
And what's your judgment, David, of public sentiment on that issue, particularly at a time when people are facing, you know, even in rich Alberta, cuts in public services?
Well, rich Alberta is very pro-U.S., as you know, and very pro-military. So, but I think in most of the rest of the country, possibly with the exception of Quebec, I think that is now a well-recognized factor. And I just don't see it changing anytime in the near future unless there's some dramatic occurrence, some cataclysm that is actually traceable to Canada or to Canadian laxness, either on the defense side or on the security side. That could do some great harm.
And so my devil's advocate question, or do you want to answer the first one?
Well, I was going to say on the border side, there are kind of two big dangers of a kind of political backlash. I would say the biggest one is if there's no payoff on the facilitation side. I mean, the quid pro quo from the Canadian side is we're going to do these various things to harden the perimeter, and the deal is you're going to make it easier to get across the border. Now, interestingly, the U.S. doesn't see it that way. You talk to U.S. officials that say, well, of course it's in the Canadian interest to harden their perimeter. Doesn't Canada want to keep terrorists out the same way we do? So the Americans haven't completely bought into this quid pro quo. But if you don't get any improvement on the facilitation side, if none of the issues that Jason brought up in the previous panel get dealt with, I think there's going to be real frustration on the Canadian side.
Right.
You know, we've done all these things.
Isn't there a
Yeah.
Canadian sense that the Americans are a little crazy?
Absolutely.
You know,
Absolutely. Yeah, that they're overreacting to the terrorist danger and all of that. And I think the Canadians are going to say, look, we are doing all these things to get with the program on border security and counterterrorism. If we don't get a payoff in terms of easier travel and trade across the border, I think there's going to be real frustration in Canada. One of the things that they're trying to build into the current initiative is a real set of public performance benchmarks. I mean, a lot of the performance benchmarks now are lousy. I mean, if you've ever looked at the border wait time stuff, you know, that comes from the border guy kind of sticking his head out and going, see down there, that looks like about 13 minutes to me. Yeah. You know, and you know, I mean, they're talking about putting in place now real electronic systems that actually measure in a serious way how long it takes to get across. There's a whole host of other measures. Yeah. So if that doesn't get dealt with, I think that's a big problem. The other potential is the privacy stuff, which I raised previously. You know, if there are a handful of cases of really egregious privacy violations, Canadian government sharing sensitive personal information with the U.S., which prevents people from getting in.
Gets people tortured.
Well, yeah, I mean, that's the worst case scenario. But, you know, even gets, it has happened, absolutely. But even, you know, gets a Canadian thrown in a U.S. jail overnight for no reason. You could see a real backlash. So those are the two danger points in this initiative, and that is why it is. You know, I said it was politically courageous for the Harper government. I think the reason is because there is the real potential for a backlash here if it doesn't work.
Okay, I think if you guys have the appetite for it, we have time for one more question, please, sir.
I'd like to ask Professor Bercuson to develop a little bit the connecting topics of Canada's view of NATO. And Canada's view of the U.S. Military and cooperation with the U.S. military, and the question of the U.S. as world policeman. The fact is that in general, as the U.S. goes, so goes NATO. In that sense, Afghanistan and Iraq are, I think, almost certainly more typical than Libya, for example. How would Canada respond if the U.S. at some point decides that it's time for NATO to act against Syria, that the Arab Spring is flourishing, and it's now time to take on the really difficult issue, the really difficult instance of Syria?
Purely hypothetical, without question, but we would be there in one form or another. We might not be there with combat aircraft, although we were, probably many people in this room don't know that we were one of the coalitions. We provided fighter jets, attack jets for the air war against Libya from the very beginning. I think we would be there. We might not be there with fighter aircraft, but we would be there in a logistical sense. There's no way that Canada is going to thumb its nose at NATO. So I didn't mean to imply that in any way, shape, or form. But what I did mean to say was that I think when you now trace back to 1999 and the Kosovo Air War and all the difficulties that emerged then, I think Canadians in the military are now looking back at the Afghanistan experience and saying, we were really let down by NATO. Now that may not be true, and NATO could say to Canada, you really let us down for 20 or 30 years by not having sufficient troops in Germany, and so on and so on and so forth. But from the Chief of the Defense Staff right down to Lieutenant Colonel Hope, they are not enthusiastic about going to war with NATO in the future. It doesn't mean they won't do it, but it means they'll be very careful about it. They know that the United States is not NATO, and NATO is not the United States. There are many capabilities that the U.S. has that NATO does not have. And they're very well aware of that today, if they were not very well aware of that before Afghanistan.
Okay, I think we're going to have to leave it there. As promised, I think our panelists have more than lived up to their billing. Absolutely expert and nuanced discussion of the issues. I thought it was really, really terrific. Ted, David, thank you very, very much.
Thanks very much.
Thank you, John, for organizing this. And I think we now all go upstairs to the 20th floor for lunch and a keynote speech by the Canadian Minister of Defence, Peter MacKay.
Thank you.